Okay, good morning, everyone. We have with us Sarah Oelsner and Graham Scholefield, both managing partners of Scitaris, consulting firm specialized on R&D with pharma and biotech. You both have done a lot of work on COVID, and so it's our pleasure to host you this morning. Before we start with questions, maybe Graham, do you want to say a word about the work you've done recently with this topic?
Yeah, sure. So, we spend a little bit of time with our clients and also obviously with some of our investment activities, keeping track of what's happening in the vaccine space. And so we've been keeping track over this over the past few months. And so we'll have a little short article coming out after this webinar as well, just giving a summary of some of the interesting insights we've come up with. But hopefully we'll deliver some of those on the call on this webinar as well.
Right. So one of the questions that a lot of investors, but also the public at large has is, how effective is the vaccine going to be in terms of stemming the pandemic? And obviously, I'm referring to the vaccine that's been launched in the UK recently. How do you think it's going to affect the pandemic?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I mean, it fundamentally breaks down into three things. Does the vaccine work? I.e., does it vaccinate against COVID? Does it prevent disease? Can you get it to all the people? And do the people want to take it? They're the three things it fundamentally breaks down to. Does it work? So the vaccine that's just been approved in the UK is from Pfizer and BioNTech. This is highly effective. Even by vaccine standards, this is actually highly effective. And so the answer to that is clearly yes. There's two other very advanced vaccines, one of them from Moderna, which will probably get UK approval imminently, and another one from Oxford and AstraZeneca, which has also been in the news. The Moderna one also works, almost exactly the same data as the Pfizer-BioNTech one. The Oxford-AstraZeneca one has got, by contrast, bad data. It's still not bad for vaccines on the scale of things, but it's not as good. So in answer to the question, does it work? Yes, there's 2 out of the 3 leading vaccines do, and the one which is approved first is one of the better ones. The second question, can we get it to all the people? This is where it gets a little bit complicated, and you get some of the intricacies of deploying drugs quickly to a large population. The one that's just been approved in the UK, the Pfizer vaccine, it actually needs to be stored at -80 for its almost the entire time. Which means you have to do things like ship it on dry ice, you have to have a -80 freezer, all these sort of things which aren't normal, shall we say, in personally a lot of certainly GP practices in the UK. And things like this. So this creates an issue, both a headache in terms of paperwork and a headache in terms of getting it to the people. And so this will kind of be a limitation. It's got to the point where even there's discussions of whether there's going to be a shortage of dry ice or for shipping, which is obviously kind of almost ludicrous. But that's there's could be an issue there. The good thing is the Moderna vaccine, which is the other one, which will probably get approved soon and is also as effective as the Pfizer one. This one doesn't require this. This is actually stable in the fridge for up to a month. So this completely eliminates that as a problem. Still, we're a Western society, highly developed healthcare system, NHS is centralized. So we probably could manage with the cold chain to some degree anyhow. But for other countries, it might be more of an issue. So can we get it to the people? I would say yes, at least for one of the 2 leading vaccines, that's certainly true. And then the final point is willingness to take the vaccine. Now, of course, there is many, I would say, discussions, especially on the internet of, vaccines create all these problems, blah, blah, blah. Frankly, almost all of these are incorrect. Vaccines are extremely safe and they're extremely effective. They're by far the most effective drug class that we as humans have ever developed. They've saved millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of lives over the decades we've had them, the last 50, 60, 70 years. So, there is no general problem, I would say. The willingness to take it in the UK is actually pretty good. So as a survey by Kantar very recently showed that about 75% of people are very willing to take the vaccine, which is great because usually you need about, upwards of 60 to 70% to actually have an effective control of the pandemic. Other countries, this is somewhat less so, France and the US notably. And so at least from a UK perspective, I do think that the willingness to take the vaccine which can then therefore, break the pandemic. So the three fundamental criteria are fulfilled. So then it becomes a time question. And so the UK has just released who they will vaccinate first, which unsurprisingly is the most at risk. So the care home, people are over 80, then followed by the hospital people and the people over 75, and then slowly going down the age bracket. And these are the people most likely to die from COVID. And so what we're going to see first is a reduction of deaths and probably a minimal reduction of cases, because these people will be trying to avoid getting COVID anyway. These are your grandma and granddaddy you're trying not to infect. And so they're seeing your children through a glass pane. These are the people. And so you will see a reduction in deaths first, because they're most likely to die. And it'll follow with a reduction in cases, because most of the cases are probably not transmitted amongst the elderly now, at least. So that's my expectation. When this happens in time will largely be dependent on how quick we can roll it out and how quick we can manufacture it. But I kind of expect probably within the next 3 months, you'll see the reduction in deaths, or at least a control of the deaths, assuming we can manufacture it quick enough. And, there's still questions around this, but let's keep the fingers crossed there. That isn't clear. And then hopefully, by the end of next year, the majority of it will be under control. But this is largely dependent on manufacturing volume, which is still unclear at the moment. But overall, I would say, to answer your question, the answer is clearly yes. And to be honest, to my surprise, I expected the vaccine not to be available until, the end of Q1, Q2 next year, which is kind of true for the standard vaccines, but not for this one. These two are the two main ones, should I say. And so, this, I can only congratulate really the companies in being able to bring this forward so quickly. It's really unprecedented.
Thanks, Graham. I guess the other question comes to mind then is, obviously it's reassuring to hear that, those vaccines are effective, but it's tougher to measure the long-term effects maybe of those vaccines. And Sarah, what's your view on this in terms of, is it going to be very effective in terms of immunity? Are there side effects that we don't know about that can come up in a few years?
Yeah, thanks, Rafael. I think that's a good question as well. Maybe let's stay with the efficacy for the first part. I mean, what we have seen is that first of all, people that have undergone a disease of active disease with COVID-19, the majority seems to develop a quite robust immunity, at least from what we understand. You may have heard of cases where people got reinfected and got it a second time. So this seems to be in very individual cases happening, but these are seem to be very rare. And I would say this is not unheard of in the field of immunology. So when it comes to the vaccines, one thing that we've observed so far is that quite surprisingly, the antibody, so the titers of the vaccine go down the antibodies go down relatively quickly. So that raised a bit of worries. However, there's still cellular immunity that may kick in, and we don't know yet long term how this is gonna play out. So this is still a question mark, because obviously we just haven't had that much of time to monitor it. So there is a chance where we have something being set up in the future that I could see, which is more like a seasonal type of vaccination, where, like what we have with the flu, that could be happening because we might notice that there are changes maybe to the virus strain, or that there may not be a super long-term immunity developed. All of these are questions to be addressed in terms of efficacy. But as Graham said as well, vaccines are really one of the greatest, I think, developments in human history, and very efficacious in general. We do it with the flu every season. So it's not like this is a complete deal breaker or a red flag and we need to worry about it. So the second point of your question on the safety, kind of a similar thing, right? We've had now a month to test it in several 10,000s of patients in very large, really well-regulated studies, where the safety profile of these different vaccines have been tested very thoroughly. And so far, what has been observed in terms of adverse events isn't too dissimilar from what you see with vaccines that we've been using for decades now. So I'll not say that there's zero, adverse events at all. You will have an occasional people that develop fever or something like that. And that's something you get with flu vaccines as well. Yeah. Again, long term, so talking about years from now, we cannot answer that question right now. The safety profile as it stands, monitoring it over a couple of months, however, is in the ballpark of vaccines that people have been using for decades in my mind. And yeah. Okay,
great. And then last question around, the technology that's being used, especially for the new vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine. First of all, how novel it is, and then how does it compare with the other vaccines that are being discussed or being tested, like the Russian one or the Chinese one, that are getting a lot of press?
So the general notion that this technology is quite new is correct, but perhaps I just step back a bit to some high school biology so we can understand like what's going on a little bit. So you have the virus, the COVID-19 virus. This is made up of proteins, which are amino acids, and our bodies are made up of a lot of different proteins, hundreds of thousands of them. And so different proteins stick together to make the virus in a simplistic way. And then the proteins, the design of the proteins, the information of that is kept in RNA, ribonucleic acid, which this is a simple chemical string, and this is essentially, you can compare it to computer code for simplicity. And this tells our body what protein to make, and that protein then assembles whatever it is. So in this case, if we get infected with COVID-19, what happens is the virus tells our body to make more of its own proteins, which then it creates more COVID-19. So that's basically a way that it works on high school biology level. So our vaccines historically have usually come in one of two flavors. One, you grow the virus or the bacteria in vats in manufacturing facilities, and then you kill them, right? So you heat and inactivate it, or you genetically modify it, or you do something to make it not a threat to humans. And then you then inoculate people with this, and this generates immunity. This has been done for decades, right? This was almost the way the first vaccine was discovered back in the day as well, almost. So that's fairly standard. And there's a few vaccines that are in the pipeline which have that method of manufacture. One of which is actually the J&J vaccine, and one of the China vaccines is actually an activated virus as well. And so then we move on to the next step, which is the proteins that make up the virus. This is when you get, basically, the way this works is you take a bunch of bacteria in a big manufacturing facility, and you get them to pump out the protein you want. And then you inoculate people with this protein, and this then allows the body to recognize that in the proper virus and then wipe them out. And so this is also a very standard way of making vaccines. And so as a couple of the US companies that are following this approach, and also this was the approach, as I say, been done by several people. And so the new technology is now looking at RNA, right? So if you remember from our high school biology, this is the part before protein synthesis. This is where the information that encodes the protein. Now, the beauty of this is you don't need large vats of anything to make it. It's a simple, well, not simple, it's a complicated chemical molecule, but one that scientists have been manufacturing in the labs for decades. We've very massively great handle on how to make this thing at high volumes. And so what we're essentially doing with more novel technology is give this RNA to the patients and tell the patients basically their own body makes the protein, which we would normally just give them, and then the body reacts to that protein. So it's like an earlier step in the pathway. And so it makes complete logical scientific sense you would do this. And by definition, isn't any more of a threat than giving the protein, because you ultimately end up with the same end substrate. So it cannot be any more threatening than this.
Maybe adding to this, it's even thinking from that perspective a bit less threatening to the body, because your body makes it yourself. It's engineered by the human cell. As Graham said before, a lot of proteins that you do manufacture in bacteria, these also have different processing, etc., mechanisms like glycosylation patterns, etc., which you also need to engineer. And so effectively going that step beforehand and having your own body do that protein you want is actually a pretty smart way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely on point, Sarah. Thanks. And you know, so it's really quite a nice idea and works quite well. And furthermore, whilst this is the first RNA-based vaccine, that is true, it is not the first RNA-based therapy. There are others already approved in different diseases, one of which is Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So it's not novel in the sense of, for science, this isn't really that novel. It's novel for society, but for science, it's really not. And so, you know, the modality itself is I wouldn't say a significant risk, certainly now that it's been in so many patients, but really from a scientific standpoint, it wasn't really either.
And how does it compare with the Chinese and the Russian vaccine? Are they using the same technologies? Is it very different?
So most of the other vaccines are using more standard technologies. So the China vaccines are, for instance, inactivated virus. The Russian vaccine is a genetically modified virus, which is then essentially inactivated. So they're all up at the first pass step of the chain, which I discussed before. They're basically manufacturing the virus and then busting it in some way or another, so it's not effective anymore. So these are very standardized approaches, which is why, by and large, they're also quite a bit further behind. Obviously, the Russian vaccine has been approved for a while on, you know, very small amounts of data, which would never have made it in our society. But at least for the headline data, it doesn't actually look that bad, right? With all the caveats that comes around that, but it doesn't look that bad. So they're just using, I would say, more standard approaches. And the real advantage for the reason we have a vaccine now is because it's a novel technology, because you can make it ultra quick. Otherwise, we would still be waiting until Q1 next year, Q2 next year.
Understood. Great. Well, thank you very much to both of you. This concludes our webcast, and great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael.